Let me bring you up to date with events on the final day of the Airthings Masters. And we need to look at the two finalists, Levon Aronian and Timur Radjabov. Now, Radjabov won the first set on day one. So Aronian had to win this second set to force a tiebreak. This was game one, and Levon certainly played very aggressively. This was a spectacular game, so hang on. Well, it's a fairly gentle start to Giocopiano, but here Aronian sharpens the game with bishop g5, pinning along this diagonal, pinning the knight to the queen. Now, this works because the black bishop is outside the pawn chain. If that bishop were on e7, it wouldn't be a problem. But this is potentially very annoying for black. So Radjabov does the right thing and pushes that bishop back straight away. So you can see this whole idea with bringing the bishop out to g5 is incredibly provocative. Black advances on the king side, driving the bishop back. But in advancing these pawns, of course, that weakens black's king. Now, it could also turn out in black's favour. It could be that these pawns advance and cramp white on the king side, and could be the start of a pawn storm. It could go either way. a5 prevents white expanding here, gives the bishop a little bit of room to retreat. It's interesting, after that pawn advance here, actually Raja plays very calmly. You know, I've seen Ding play this position, and he's played knight h7 followed by h5 and really goes for it. But Radjabov, he is such a calm player, such a restrained player, and, well, I think a pragmatic player as well. And he just makes sure everything is just nice and tidy. He doesn't launch into an attack on the king side straight away. So both sides have chances here because, of course, in playing g5, that weakens these squares. And that's why Aronian has bounced the knight back to f1. It's looking to get into e3 and then f5. So here, Aronian plays bishop b5, keeping this bishop on the board, and that piece certainly can be very useful in the attack. He could just exchange here as well, but bishop b5 and knight e3, so that knight comes to, well, really the dream square in these kind of positions. You can see that f5 square is weakened. You might recall a superb game that Magnus Carlsen played against Nikita Vityugov in the Tata Steel tournament a year ago, January 2020, where Carlsen managed to get control over f5 in a very, very similar kind of position and won a beautiful game. But Radjabov is aware of what white is trying to do, and knight e7 is a careful move. That knight covers these two important outposts. a4 protects the bishop, c6, the bishop comes back to c4. Knight g6, so this is a nice maneuver, of course, from Radjabov. He feels that he can potentially go on the attack with knight f4. Queen c2, now that, as we're going to see, is a very interesting move. Of course, it just allows the rook into the middle, but sometimes this queen can be very useful on this diagonal. Queen e7, so really the tension is building. So far we have had no piece exchanges at all, but now things absolutely explode. Now Aronian played d4. He certainly doesn't need to do this. He could just hold the position with h3, which I quite like actually, and then perhaps drop the knight back to h2 and into g4 to try and get greater control over these light squares. It's not a bad idea. h3 I think is reasonable. But instead, well, he wanted to go for it and played d4, cracking open the position. Now, it's a provocative move because, of course, after this capture here, then the e-pawn is vulnerable. So if knight takes pawn, in fact, it is possible for black just to take on e4, but, well, Aronian, of course, understood that, and he's seen a really interesting attacking idea. First of all, he took the knight off, and then instead of moving this knight, he played e5. So you can see with the bishop on this diagonal and the queen on this diagonal, things are brewing nicely. And here, Radjabov played pawn takes knight. I will return to this position at the end of the game because it is absolutely critical here. And in fact, something was missed. But let's continue with the game. It's very complex. Pawn takes knight. And now queen g6 check. Exploiting this pin on the diagonal. So Aronian is a piece down at the moment. Now his queen is on prise. Queen takes pawn check. And the knight blocks on h7. So Aronian still a piece down, but he threatens mate in one with that move bishop d3. Queen takes knight. But this sacrifices a whole rook. Pawn takes pawn f2, king f1, and pawn takes rook here. Rook takes. As Aronian said afterwards, this is reminiscent of a famous game in the King's Gambit between Spassky and Bronstein. I might show you that game in a little bit. Must remember to do that. So what's the score? Well, Aronian now a rook and a piece down. He's threatening mate in one. And here is a very important moment in the game. How does black defend the knight on h7? Well, Raja played bishop f5. What happens on f5, which would of course open this line? Well, watch what happens. Pawn takes pawn, attacking the queen. Queen f7, got to move. Rook takes, and now simply knight g5 is a winning move. This is a really important variation, very simple variation, but I'll show you why that's important later on. The knight attacks the queen, but also adds more pressure to the knight here, and basically black cracks in this position. The queen is on prise, queen takes pawn, queen takes knight, mate. Bear that one in mind, I'll come back to it later. But here, Raja did find a way to continue. He played bishop f5. So that had to be taken. Mate still threatens. So now Aronian is only a rook down. f6 clears the 7th rank. Pawn takes pawn. Queen f7. So why did Radjabov give up that bishop? Well, we can see why here, because now black threatens a fatal check on c4 that the white king cannot escape because that bishop controls these squares. So basically, black now threatens a deadly counterattack. So there's no time for knight g5 in this position because of queen c4 and mate in a couple of moves. But in fact, Aronian does have a win in this position. There are in fact two ways to win. One is to play a very subtle move here, rook d1, with the simple idea that after queen c4 the bishop can retreat and stop the mate. And then white is going to continue with knight g5. Sometimes bishop g6 followed by f7 is winning as well. And sometimes knight h4 is winning with the idea knight g6 sometimes. Basically, white should be winning that position. And there's another beautiful way to win. Maybe this is even more subtle, and that's to exchange here. Now again, knight g5 allows queen c4 and mate, but here white can play pawn to b3. This is absolutely incredible. Idea is that the c4 square is covered, so black no longer has queen c4 mate. Obviously the queen can't take the pawn because of queen takes knight. And now white wins. There is no defense. For example, rook g, and now knight g5 is the threat now. So let's say rook g8 covers the g5 square, but h4, bishop e3, and now h5. It's slow motion, but it's deadly. Let's say rook g3, okay, random move, bishop g6, attacking the queen moves aside, and f7, and no defense to queen takes knight mate or f8 either. Absolutely incredible. I think that's the one I really like the most, actually, taking e8 and playing b3. Wonderful. But instead, Aronian played rook e6. It looks like such a tempting move, but he overlooked something. It does block the check. I mean, it's a spectacular idea. After rook takes rook, knight g5. So there's no queen c4 check. So the rook interferes. However, rook takes pawn saves black. And now the best that Aronian has is to take the queen. That's what he did. But the queen and bishop alone cannot force mate against these pieces. So the best he had was to take here. So it's now queen against two rooks and a bishop. And there are lots of checks. But if the king can escape, then the two rooks and a bishop should be winning. So Raja tries to move out with his king. Lots of checks. But round about here, he lost his nerve and decided to just allow a draw by perpetual check. And that's how the game ended, in a draw. I mean, white certainly has nothing better. Could have Radjabov have played for the win? Well, yeah, I think so. In this position, he could play king g8. And if queen g5, then actually the king escapes like this. It can escape to the queen side. In this position, white could play queen a5, which is a bit irritating because it pins. So it's not so easy for black to break free here. Nevertheless, one feels that with some patient manoeuvring, I mean, that stops any, well, I suppose there's a check here, but I feel that black is better here, or maybe f3 is possible as well. It's tricky. You know, black still has a lot of work to do here. There's a lot of checks, and Radjabov clearly just thought, okay, this still could be very tricky. But if he wants to play for a win, that's the way to go. But let me take you back to this position. So this is right at the start of the combination. So Aronian has just pushed the pawn to e5, opening this diagonal. And here is where Radjabov played pawn takes knight on e3. Incredibly, there is a win for black in this position. Can you spot it? Well, I wouldn't expect you to spot this, really. It is really difficult, but it's fascinating. So let me just show you this. So pawn to d3. That is the move. queen takes. Got to take it. Now f takes e3. So black is a piece up. So let's try exactly the same attacking idea for white as in the game. And now bishop d3, threatening mate. So black can take that rook. And mate is threatened. So, but what's the difference this time? f5. Okay, we saw this idea before. E takes f6, queen f7. So at the moment, let's get the score. Black is a rook and a piece up. And previously, we saw that knight g5 was the winning move here. Okay, first of all, let's exchange the rooks. Rook takes, rook takes. But here, knight g5 simply doesn't work. There is an obvious refutation, and then it's queen takes, pawn, check. Forcing an exchange of queens, of course, because the queen on h6 is attacked, and that's simply winning for black, of course. But you can see the difference in this position, that the white king is not protected. If we come back to the game continuation, let's just see, let's compare and contrast. When in the game, we had this position, and their f5 didn't work, because here you can see there's a pawn there and knight g5 is just winning. So that is the difference. Very subtle indeed, but and in a rapid play game almost impossible to spot, but d3 would have been the winning move. But well, just a fantastic game. Such imagination from Aronian to go for this attack, this piece sacrifice. But, well, I have to say Radjabov played in such a pragmatic way, and he won a beautiful endgame in game 2 and closed out the match by drawing in game 3. So that was basically it. He won the Airthings Masters and pocketed $65,000. Not bad. There you go. More coming up on the channel very soon. I do hope you've enjoyed my coverage of the Airthings Masters. Hard to say. But yeah, more coming soon. Thanks for watching.